2 weeks before my wedding, I discovered my fiancé cheated with my cousin. The engagement collapsed, the family split, and 2 years later he returned with a crumpled envelope and a note promising buried secrets.
I am Maria.
2 weeks before my wedding, I found out Jorge had cheated on me with my cousin Andrea, and Andrea kept saying she was pregnant. The engagement dissolved in a single night, the wedding was cancelled, and the family split into sides like a bad soap opera. Months of silence followed, messages ignored, holiday plans erased. I moved out of the apartment we'd been trying to fix together and learned how to sleep alone again, with a small, hard fact of betrayal lodged in my chest. I tried to make sense of it in the stupid way people do. I replayed tiny moments, searching for a different meaning. The ring sat in a small velvet box in my dresser and suddenly looked like a prop from someone else's life. Friends called and offered the expected phrases and comfort, lines that sounded rehearsed and distant. I cleaned the apartment until every surface shone because cleaning felt like control. I walked through rooms and cataloged memories the way you might inventory damage, and I tried to keep busy enough that the nights did not stretch too long. The family argument that followed is a memory I can still reach for like a bruise. What should have been a private mess became a public performance. Phones hit tables, voices rose, and people who had been close to me for years chose sides. Andrea cried and called herself a coward. Some relatives accused Jorge, others accused me, alliances that had taken decades to form frayed in a single evening. After that, invitations stopped arriving, holiday plans erased themselves, and our family calendar began to look like a map of places where we no longer went together. In the months that followed, I focused on practical things because practical things let me pretend the world had not ruptured. I found a job that paid decently, painted the spare room 2 calming colors, and learned new recipes so I could make small dinners that did not require conversation. I told myself my life was steady because I kept time with tasks. Still, the memory of betrayal did not leave me. It sat like an extra person in the apartment, quiet and sure that I knew it was there. 2 years later, time had made some edges less raw but not gone. I had routines and friends who had survived sides of the divide, and I had rebuilt parts of myself I thought were gone. Then one afternoon Jorge asked to meet. He sounded small on the phone and asked for the café where we had once spent lazy Sundays. He arrived with an envelope in his jacket, and he refused to show me its contents. He said there was context, and that was the only explanation he would give at first. At the café, he sat across from me and kept his fingers on the edge of the table like someone steadying a small animal. He said he had something to tell me that might change what I thought I knew. I answered that if it involved Andrea, I did not want to hear more. He answered back, and the conversation swung between apology and explanation. He admitted that after the wedding collapsed he had gone through a period of confusion and doubt, and that he had asked for a paternity test because he was trying to figure out whether his suspicion had any basis. That test, he said, had complicated things in ways he had not expected. He put the envelope on the table, and for a moment it felt like the whole café held its breath. He told me the paternity test results had been devastating in their own way because although the results showed he was not the father, the doubt his suspicion caused had already torn things apart. He explained he had received an anonymous message accusing Andrea of lying about who the father was. He said he had followed that lead and had found messages and documents that made him question the version of events everyone had accepted. He pushed the edge of the envelope toward me without letting go. I read the message and I could not ignore it, he said. It accused Andrea of lying and suggested someone else might be the father. I dug through old messages and found things that did not fit the story I had been told. I should have told you earlier, and I am sorry I did not. I brought these documents because you deserve to see them and to decide what they mean for you. I asked him why he had not spoken sooner. He admitted fear and pride, the strange combination that keeps people quiet even when silence hurts others. He said he had hoped the truth would surface without him having to be the one to say it. He did not try to erase what happened. He did not ask for a second chance. He only wanted to hand me the envelope and step away. His voice carried the old cadence I remembered, the way he used to explain problems like puzzles that could be solved with patience and careful steps. I demanded to see the message he cited. He hesitated and said he could not share one piece without giving context he feared would hurt more than help. That hesitation felt like the same old pattern. I felt anger flare up because it felt like asking for respect was a new kind of bravery and he was refusing to grant it. At the same time, my curiosity pried at the edges of my composure. What had Andrea done that we did not know? Who else could be involved? We left the café without opening the envelope. As we walked, I noticed a woman sitting across the street watching the café. She did not move and she did not look away. She was older, with a practical coat and hands folded over a handbag as if she were holding herself steady. Jorge glanced toward her and his face changed for a flicker of a second. There was fear there. I asked him about the woman and he said nothing. He folded his hands and walked me to the bus, and the quiet between us felt long and sharp. That night I wrote in a journal I had not touched in years. I listed questions like items on a shopping list. Who sent the anonymous message? Why would Andrea claim the baby was Jorge's if it was not? What role did pride and silence play in hollowing a marriage before it began? I realized that not all answers arrive in ways that let you choose how to receive them. Some answers come as small packages that demand immediate consumption, and others come slowly over time. I have been learning new words for what I will and will not accept. Boundaries is the most practical of them. I learned how to say no without dramatics and how to keep distances without turning people into villains. I have also been surprised by compassion. Sometimes I imagine Andrea as a younger version of me who panicked and made a terrible decision. Empathy does not mean agreement or forgetting. Instead, it helps me see the complexity of a person who acted badly and also suffered. For now, I have not replied to Jorge. I have not taken the envelope from him, and I have not decided whether to read its contents if he gave it to me. I am protecting the pace of my life because I have learned that haste and rage are poor advisors. I do want the truth if the truth will free us from guessing and allow genuine repairs. I also want to avoid being drawn back into a drama that will leave me smaller if I participate from the wrong angle. I am not interested in a public ceremony of apologies. If there is acknowledgement to be made, it must feel honest and not performative. I am tired of being the subject people argue over. I want to be the author of my own narrative again. I want to make decisions from a place of strength rather than reactivity. That requires time, and I have been granting myself that time. I remember specifics because specifics are how I anchor myself. The exact shade of blue on the napkins at the rehearsal dinner, the way Jorge's laugh used to be full and easy, the tiny chip in our favorite plate. I also remember the first time I saw Andrea and Jorge together on a late afternoon that made the city look like it could forgive anything. They seemed ordinary and private, which made what came after feel like a theft. Sometimes I go through old photos and pause the frame at moments where everything still seemed uninterrupted. Those images are treacherous because they can make you imagine a continuity that was never guaranteed. People have offered their versions of the truth in the months since. Some narratives make sense, others are motivated by convenience or stubborn allegiance. I have learned to listen politely and then filter what I keep. That has become a skill I did not expect to need. I have sat with lawyers and with friends and with therapists. The therapist's room was not a place of dramatic revelations but a slow argument for patience. Therapy taught me how to ask clearer questions of myself and of others, how to hold a boundary without burning it to ash. There were moments when I suspected I might be the kind of person who could never forgive, and other moments where forgiveness looked like a tiny mercy I might one day grant to someone who had earned it honestly. Those are different exercises, and I treat them as separate things. When the paternity test result arrived for Jorge, someone read the numbers and a collective breath seemed to leave the room. Relief and accusation are odd partners. Relief because doubt was answered, accusation because doubt had already done damage. After that, the anonymous message arrived and changed the geometry of the situation. It suggested that what we believed might be false. Suddenly choices felt like ajar doors, and every decision risked walking into a corridor with more questions. I have been cataloging what I am willing to accept now: transparency, accountability, and concrete actions. Apologies without action are like hollow ornaments. I want proof of change and a willingness to repair harm that does not require me to erase my own pain. There is also the quiet domestic work of repairing a life after betrayal, making appointments, answering emails, fixing the boiler, ordering new light bulbs. That practical work steadies me in a way dramatic confrontation never did. Small rituals have become my refuge: watering plants on Tuesday mornings, making a list of one thing I accomplished each day, calling my sister for exactly 5 minutes. Those rituals are not dramatic, but they add up. They are the kind of work that rebuilds confidence in the slow, steady way that a scaffold supports a house under repair. I also started checking facts more carefully, because I have learned that stories mutate when passed from mouth to mouth, and documents or messages are often the only anchors in disputable waters. When the anonymous message appeared, it felt like someone had reached into the room and rearranged the furniture of our assumptions without asking the occupants what they preferred. It is possible that the anonymous message was sent by someone with good intentions. It is also possible it was sent by someone with a grudge. I have conversations with friends that are generous and also practical, because people want to help, but they also need to know how to do that without causing more harm. I have learned to ask for what I need: clarity, slow time, clear documents, and space to process before being asked to make decisions that will affect other people's lives as well as my own. There is a legal element that is boring and necessary: paternity tests, consent forms, text records, and a kind of tedious documentation that provides a thin but important frame for emotional decisions. Organizing paperwork can feel comforting because it transforms emotional chaos into categories that can be approached deliberately, one by one. In private, I think about the child at the center of all this and wonder what a safe adult life should have looked like for them, separate from the adults who made mistakes. I also think about shame and how it travels from person to person when secrets are kept, and about the need for care to prevent cycles of blame and punishment from continuing. There are evenings when I allow myself to feel exhausted by the long list of things I can't control and then shift attention to the trivial but reparative tasks I can accomplish in a night. I think about the structural ways betrayal rearranges life, like furniture that used to fit now feeling awkward and too large for the space, demanding constant adjustment. Once trust is broken, ordinary decisions carry extra weight because everything you do after seems to be casting a vote for how seriously you take the past. I know this is messy, and I know my timing was terrible, Jorge said during one of our conversations. I am not trying to ask for an easy fix. I am trying to correct what I can, and I am offering whatever evidence I have found. I understand if you choose not to look. I only wanted you to know. So this is where I am writing from: a couch with a lamp, a cup of coffee gone cold, and a notebook with a half-written list. I have not forgiven blindly. I have not allowed myself to be baited into reopening old arguments. But I am open to facts and to truth. If more emerges, I will consider it with the care I afford my own heart. For now, I keep the envelope as a possibility and a reminder that some truths arrive wrapped in paper and demand to be treated with caution. Two weeks before my wedding, I discovered Jorge had cheated with my cousin Andrea, who claimed she was pregnant. The engagement collapsed, the family fractured, and for 2 years the truth was a rumor that left everyone raw. A paternity test later showed the baby was not Jorge's. Recently, he reappeared with an envelope and a claim tied to anonymous messages. I haven't answered him yet. This is where the story picks up. I remember the way the café smelled that afternoon, a warm, citrus-tinged air that made the room feel smaller and somehow safer. I had come prepared to be distant, to keep the meeting short and strictly practical. 2 years had taught me the usefulness of boundaries, and I intended to hold them. When Jorge slid into the seat across from me, his jacket smelled faintly of rain. His hands were shaking in the way I recognized from old apologies, the kind that arrive before the words. He placed an envelope on the table between us and kept his fingers near it like a nervous compass. At first he spoke like a man making careful steps across uncertain ground. "I didn't want to bother you," he started, But there are things I need to say. His voice was measured, the old explanation cadence that used to calm arguments because he sounded as if he had a plan. I kept my expression even, because that is the one clarity I allow myself in conversations that used to feel like mine and are now contested territory. When he said he had evidence he had found, the café seemed to grow narrower. I could feel the edges of the room tighten around the small paper envelope between us. He kept the envelope between us. I asked what it was. He would not tell me the specifics. He said only that it was related to the paternity tests and to messages he had found after everything had fallen apart. He insisted several times that I take it and read for myself, but every time I reached for it he tightened his hand and stopped me, which felt like an old habit reasserting itself, controlling information, deciding how much someone else is allowed to know.
Why now? I asked.
It is the practical question that sits on the surface of any moment that feels like a rerun of old trauma. Why bring this to me after 2 years in which you said nothing and let everything burn? The question wasn't casual. I wanted the history of choices. He answered in a way that sounded rehearsed, because he had rehearsed it in the months after. Fear, pride, confusion. He admitted he had been ashamed. He said hearing the test result had relieved some part of him but had opened another kind of worry he could not set aside. He said he had received an anonymous message that suggested the paternity results were incomplete or misleading. He claimed to have followed leads, to have seen things that didn't fit the public story. I asked him then why he had not told me when he first suspected. He said his silence was cowardice. He said he had been trying to collect facts before saying anything because he feared speaking would make him look like he had been motivated by revenge rather than truth. I felt the old anger flare. It was the same anger that had once fueled Rose and court decisions, but now it was tempered by the understanding that anger does not necessarily equal clarity. I pressed him to specify whether the envelope contained the anonymous message. He said no, that what he had in the envelope were copies of messages and documents he had pulled together to make sense of the accusation. He would not share the anonymous sender's identity. He palmed the envelope again, as if its weight held all the decisions he'd delayed. I told him straight that if he wanted me to take it seriously, he would have to allow me to examine what he claimed to have found without theatrics. He nodded but did not open the envelope for me. I noticed a woman across the street while Jorge talked. She was seated in her car and seemed to be observing the cafe window more than the street. Her face was steady in a way that made my neck prick. I pointed her out and he briefly looked away. He said nothing. I could feel the meeting tilt. The conversation had shifted from an economy of explanation to a scene of caution. The presence of another watcher made the moment feel less like a private reconciliation and more like a scene in which others had stakes. I tried to calibrate my response. Logic suggested the safest path was to accept the envelope, take it home, read it carefully, and decide whether to engage further. Emotion pushed me the other way. I remembered how information had been used like currency in the last fight, how secrets and half-truths had been weaponized. I told Jorge I would accept nothing that came wrapped in mystery. I asked him to tell me exactly how he had obtained what he claimed. He described texts, bank records, timestamps. He spoke in small, specific fragments that built a clearer timeline even as he withheld what he still called contextual pieces. When he mentioned the paternity test result again, I felt the old vertigo. The test had shown he was not the father. That alone had relieved some pressure even as it unsettled other people. When he said he had been sent a message that implied Andrea had lied, I felt the ground beneath that relief shift. I asked whether he had confronted Andrea. He said he had confronted her in the blunt way human beings sometimes confront, with questions and allegations that were messy and wounded. He told me the confrontation had not produced answers, only more questions. "Do you expect me to take this seriously?" I asked. The question was practical and moral at once. He answered that he didn't expect anything, that he wanted me to have the choice of looking, and that he would accept whatever decision I made. His posture now looked like someone who had been waiting in a long line and finally reached the counter and realized he could step away. I thought of the old relationship we had had, in which small choices were often framed as favors granted or withheld. This time I wanted the facts, not performances. A man at the next table laughed loudly at something on his phone. The laugh sounded obscene in a conversation about secrets. I noticed the barista's hands move, slow and practical, and I realized I needed to control my breathing. I asked Jorge about motive. Why would Andrea claim the child was his if the test said otherwise? Why would she say she was pregnant at all? He hesitated and said he didn't know. He told me he had found messages that suggested inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, replies deleted and recovered, a transfer that puzzled him, and that such pieces, added together, did not fit the story we had all settled on. Though I had told myself I would only accept facts, my curiosity pushed me forward. It felt like an itch under my skin, an insistence that if there was a story to be untangled, I wanted to see the thread. I asked him, finally, to let me look at the envelope. He hesitated and then said the documents were messy and that he did not want me to take them out of context. Context matters, he said. He sounded older in that sentence, like someone who had counted the cost of public drama and decided he wanted to avoid spectacle. I suggested then that if he could not let me see the documents, he could at least give me a precise description of what they showed. He described dates, snippets of messages, and a bank transfer that had puzzled him. The details were small and technical, but they had the effect of making the narrative more real. He spoke about timestamps he had found and the way messages had been deleted and then reappeared. He described dates that conflicted with the timeline he'd been given at the time, and those mismatches made my curiosity feel less like a moral failing and more like necessary due diligence. We talked for what felt like an hour. I took notes on my phone in a way that felt clinical, short bullets, nothing fancy. I wrote down dates he mentioned. I recorded mentally the way his voice cracked slightly when he admitted regret. I also kept track of the parts he refused to show me, the anonymous sender, the original note, the crucial message that apparently suggested Andrea had lied. The partiality of his disclosure irritated me because it forced me into a liminal state, aware of more than before but lacking the firm pieces needed to make a judgment. When he stood to leave, he said he didn't want to pressure me. He placed his hand briefly on my wrist in a gesture that was once tender and now read as an attempt at reassurance. "Read it if you want," he said. "Or don't." I just couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened when I had seen things that felt like a puzzle begging to be solved. I watched him go and felt a familiar ache of abandonment and the new, sharper ache of curiosity. As I walked home, I unfolded the situation into parts in my head like someone unwrapping an object slowly to avoid damage. Part of me wanted to close the book on Jorge entirely, to refuse any participation in a story that had already cost me too much. Another part wanted to know because I had learned that uncertainty could harden into something worse than knowledge. There was also a practical part that recognized the legal and ethical implications of ignoring possible evidence about a child's parentage. Each option felt heavy. I did not open the envelope immediately. I put it on the counter like a foreign object that required gloves. I called my sister and left a brief message because I did not want to process alone. I paged through my old notes from therapy to remind myself how to consider evidence without turning it into accusation on impulse. The envelope sat there like a question that required consent to be answered. I thought about options. I could open it alone and read, risking being manipulated by fragments. I could take it to a lawyer and have it catalogued. I could ask Jorge to let me copy the contents and then release them to a neutral third party. Each option carried cost. Each option required that I put my hand on a lever that would set something in motion. I had learned recently that choosing inaction is also a choice and carries its own consequences. The woman in the car returned to my mind. I tried to picture her face again and the way she had watched the café with a steady expression. I imagined possible roles: a neighbor worrying about gossip, a relative who had missed the message, a stranger who read the paper and happened to look up. My mind also offered darker possibilities: someone connected to Andrea or to the anonymous sender, someone who had been following any sign of revelation. I felt silly and solemn at once, silly because my imagination can run wild, solemn because lives could be affected. I made a list of boundaries for any future conversation about Jorge and Andrea. One item read, "No theatrical reveals." Another said, "Document everything before assuming motive." A third said, "Prioritize the child's well-being over adult explanations." Writing those items helped because it made decisions feel less emotional and more procedural. This is part of the repair work I have been doing, replacing reactive instincts with protocols that protect me from being pulled into performative conflict. I still have not opened the envelope. Part of me knows that when I do, the answer will reshape certain things and leave others intact. Part of me suspects the documents will be a mix, some clarifying notes, some red herrings, and a few painful confirmations. For now I keep the envelope in a drawer, not because I want to hide from truth, but because I want to read it on my terms and with support nearby. I can imagine a future in which I take it to someone neutral, perhaps a lawyer or a trusted friend who can help me parse facts without drama. Before I sleep, I replay parts of the meeting in my mind and consider the small gestures that felt like clues. The way Jorge's fingers trembled when he placed the envelope down, the way he watched the street when I pointed at the woman, the little cough he made when he said he feared making me uncomfortable. None of those details on their own solve anything. They are, however, the texture of hesitation and imperfect attempts at repair. 2 years after I found out Jorge cheated with my cousin Andrea and the wedding collapsed, a paternity test showed the baby wasn't his. Jorge reappeared with an envelope and hinted at anonymous messages that might change everything. I haven't decided whether to open it. I took the envelope to a lawyer, because by then it felt irresponsible to treat potential evidence like gossip. The lawyer's office smelled of coffee and paper, and felt less dramatic than the café had. She and I sat with an assistant who copied timestamps and scanned documents while I watched from the corner of the room like someone learning the rules of a new game. I wanted an objective frame, someone who could say whether what I held mattered and whether it should be shared with anyone else. The lawyering felt boring and honest at the same time, and that plainness suited me. I learned things the interview at the café had only hinted at. The envelope held a sequence of messages, some recovered by date, and photos whose metadata matched travel records that contradicted public accounts. Those pieces together sketched a timeline that made it hard to maintain the simpler version of events we had all accepted at first. Seeing evidence assembled by someone else was different than watching rumors circulate. Evidence demanded responses beyond gossip. I felt a strange relief at the clarity even as I braced for its consequences. When I called Andrea, she answered on the second ring. I did not want fireworks, so I agreed to meet her somewhere neutral. The meeting was awkward by design. Two people who had once been family now operating with formal distance. Andrea arrived with her hands folded, eyes red at the edges. She had the air of someone who had been carrying a secret for longer than she'd intended and had finally come to terms with its weight. We sat across from each other, and the silence lasted just long enough for both of us to measure what would be said. She denied at first, which I expected. Denial is a predictable armor, and she put it on smoothly. But when I mentioned the timestamps and a particular photograph that matched a trip she had said she took alone, her face changed. The facade cracked. She swallowed and then told a story that was as human and as messy as any. She had been afraid of becoming a single mother, afraid of judgment, and had thought naming someone stable as the child's father would buy safety. It was not excuse so much as explanation, and it landed with a heavy dullness that I could not soften with pity alone. When she finally named him, I felt my stomach drop because the name matched the messages and the photo metadata. He was an old boyfriend who had been part of Andrea's life in a past chapter that I had only heard about in passing. Presenting him with the dated messages and images in front of others left him little room to deny facts that were now public in a way that had legal and social consequences. His initial denial shifted to a quieter admission once he faced documentation he could not easily dispute. We confronted him together because at that point private confrontation felt like a necessary step toward public clarity. He denied initially, then stumbled into partial admissions as the documents were laid out. People react differently when what they can claim as memory is replaced by hard dates and photos. Andrea finally said the words aloud, "I lied about the paternity," and the room shifted in temperature. Relief and anger moved through us in different rhythms, and I felt both layered and complicated. Jorge came to a small family meeting I arranged after we had confirmations. He did not ask for dramatic absolution. He stood and addressed a room of relatives who had been entangled in the drama and said what he had been unable to say before, that his silence had been a failure, that his pride had chained him to secrecy, and that he accepted the consequences of choices he had made. He proposed therapy and a legal framework for co-responsibility with Andrea. His apology was public and plainly delivered. It didn't erase the past, but it made a promise to do the hard work of repair. I will not pretend the apology erased what happened. It did not. Instead, it set the terms for a future where actions, not words, would determine trust. Jorge arranged to meet privately with me afterward and walked me through what he had found and why he had been quiet. He admitted he had been afraid his suspicions would make him look petty and that his silence had let rumor grow. He did not offer justifications. He offered an accounting. That mattered because the accounting came with concrete offers, therapy, documented intentions, and a willingness to be held to a plan. I decided to forgive in a specific way. I forgave the man who had been my fiancé for the ways he had failed me, while not erasing the damage. Forgiveness for me was a boundary, not a restoration of the past. I chose to allow him into a practical arrangement that prioritized the child's well-being and to refuse to resume romantic intimacy. That choice felt like drawing a line that allowed for cooperation without erasing lessons. It was adult mercy with conditions, clear expectations, legal clarity, and time-tested change. Andrea agreed to therapy and to be transparent about her relationships and finances. She apologized privately and publicly, and she started taking concrete steps to rebuild trust where possible. Those steps included cooperating with legal paperwork to correct records and agreeing to a clearer legal framework for co-parenting and financial responsibility. Part of repair was not only acknowledging what she had done but accepting consequences and actively participating in solutions that would reduce harm to the child and to the rest of the family. We set up a plan that was sober and small, deliberately avoiding theatrical gestures. It included shared custody conversations guided by legal counsel, scheduled family therapy, and explicit agreements on financial support for the child. We prioritized the child's stability over adult needs for vindication. That pragmatic approach felt the least exploitative of the child's life and allowed adults to manage guilt and anger constructively. It was not perfect, but it was a start toward practical repair. There were legal steps too, formal statements, notarized admissions where Andrea agreed to certain facts she could not contest, and an agreement that the child's records would be updated with correct parentage once the evidence was clear. Yes, it was procedural, and yes, it felt cold to translate emotion into paperwork. But paperwork protects people when memories and allegiances shift. I saw the documents as scaffolding, ugly, necessary, and capable of holding weight while repair took place. One practical and surprising outcome was the clarity it provided the child. Once the legal paperwork settled, we had fewer conflicting stories to manage, and adults could choose a single, less fraught narrative for everyday conversation. We agreed to shield the child from details that were not age-appropriate and to focus adult energy on creating predictable routines, school, celebrations, and visits, so the child had fewer disruptions caused by adult disputes. That intention guided many otherwise mundane choices about scheduling and family presence. There have been small reparations that mattered. A cousin who had been distant came back after seeing the documents and apologized for choosing sides. A friend returned a message with a short line, "You were right to want the facts." Those small acknowledgments did not erase the harm, but they made the tapestry of repair less threadbare. Where people offered apologies and then sustained better behavior, relationships thawed. Where apologies weren't possible, honest distance protected everyone from further damage. Another unexpected piece was the slow unfreezing of some relationships. People who had taken sides observed the evidence and in some cases offered apologies. Not all relationships healed, and distance remained, but that distance often felt kinder than forced intimacy. Where reconciliation was healthy, it was allowed to develop naturally. Where it was not, honest boundaries kept people from causing further harm. There are days when the weight of what happened still presses, but more often I notice how ordinary things remind me that life can move forward. I make plans for small projects, a painting class, a short trip with a friend, a weekend dedicated to decluttering and making room for new things. These small commitments are not distractions, they are intentional acts of repair. They help me practice imagining a future that is not dominated by past grievances. I have also set up clearer boundaries for myself, and those boundaries feel like tools rather than punishments. Emotionally, I have found a steadier center. I still have nights when old images crowd in, but the intensity has diminished. The work of daily life, along with therapy and committed friends, has turned what felt like a constant crisis into a series of manageable tasks. The narrative of betrayal remains part of my story, but it no longer defines every choice I make. I can imagine new projects, relationships built with clearer boundaries, and a life that includes careful compassion without tolerating repeated harm. When faced with a mess that blends emotion and potential evidence, gather documentation, consult professionals, and protect the child's interests first. That advice saved me from being pulled into cycles of accusation. It allowed me to transform reactive outrage into deliberate steps that prioritized the least powerful person in the situation, the child. Those practical steps felt like standards I could point to in the future when old patterns threatened to re-emerge. In the end, the truth arrived not as a single explosive reveal, but as a sequence of confirmations that, when gathered, made a coherent picture. The anonymous message that set off alarms had been sent by someone who thought they were doing the right thing. Their method was rough, but it pushed inconsistencies into daylight. That doesn't excuse the havoc it caused, but it complicated the moral calculus and forced adults to reckon honestly with motives and consequences. My decision now is steady and pragmatic. I will not resume a romantic relationship with Jorge, but I will cooperate with him and Andrea where the child's well-being requires it. I will not pretend everything is healed. I will also not allow anger to calcify into a life-defining identity. Forgiveness, for me, is a decision to stop being defined only by what happened and to start defining myself by what I choose to build. I will continue therapy, maintain firm boundaries, and insist on documented actions rather than promises. Maybe the most surprising part is that I have found relief in the ordinary rhythm of repair. The laundry, the appointments, the slow rebuilding of trust in small interactions, these things anchor me to the future. I still wonder about small mysteries, the woman who watched the café, the moments where hesitation looked like avoidance, but most of those questions either resolved benignly or lost their urgency in the steady work of making life livable again. I will write this down not as the end, but as a deliberate closure that holds space for further truth. There will probably be days when new facts surface, and if they do, I will face them with the same protocols. Gather evidence, consult professionals, and prioritize the child's well-being. For now, the worst of the unknown feels addressed, and what remains is slow, sober, and workmanlike. The family is not whole in the way it was before, and perhaps it never will be. But there is room now for cautious rebuilding and for new definitions of care. If anything else happens, I will document it, I will consult, and I will protect the child first. For now, I am closing this series of notes with a sense that practical repair has begun. I am not naive about the future, but I am no longer captive to rumor. I have chosen boundaries, clarity, and the child's well-being as my guides. The rest I will handle with the care that complex, human mistakes deserve. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.